Buy a port. Collect money every time a ship touches your dock, whether you're awake or not. That's the pitch. Here's the number it skips. The cranes alone run $10 to $15 million each, and a working terminal needs at least 4 of them before a single ship arrives. Add yard equipment, paving, software, and deposits, and you're past $150 million before revenue exists. On the other side of that spending sits a business that, done well, nets about 3 cents on every dollar. Done badly, it disappears in a season. A company that once ran 98 ships and stranded $14 billion of cargo found that out in 2016. Here is what this actually costs. You don't buy a port. Nobody does. What you buy is a lease, a concession, usually 20 to 50 years, from a port authority that still owns the land and the water under it. The bid process alone can run into the millions before you sign anything. Engineering studies, environmental review, legal fees to prove to the port authority you can actually run the place. Then the equipment. Ship-to-shore cranes, the tall ones that reach out over the ship and lift containers straight off the deck, cost $10 to $15 million apiece, based on recent purchases at ports from Florida to Texas. A functioning terminal needs at least 4. That's $50 million before you've moved a single box. Behind the cranes, you need yard cranes to stack containers once they're off the ship, yard tractors, a chassis fleet, paving strong enough to hold containers stacked 5 high, gate technology, and power for refrigerated container plugs. Call it another $75 million. Then the compliance costs nobody puts in the pitch deck. Every terminal handling international cargo operates under federal security rules. Background checks, surveillance systems, restricted access fencing, a security plan the Coast Guard has to approve before you can legally open. Port authorities also run a competitive bidding process before granting any concession, and from first proposal to signed lease can take 2 to 3 years. Years of legal and consulting fees, with no facility generating a dollar. And the channel in front of your dock has to be deep enough for the ships calling on you, which is not yours to control. When Savannah, Georgia needed its harbor 5 feet deeper for today's larger ships, the project cost $973 million and took over 2 decades from first study to last shovel of mud. You don't write that check, but your lease, your throughput, and your entire business model depend on someone else writing it, on a timeline you don't control. Add security bonds, permitting, and the working capital to make payroll before your first invoice clears, and the honest total for a mid-size independent terminal comes in north of $150 million. That's before you've earned a dollar. Now the costs that never stop, whether ships show up or not. Labor comes first, and it's not small. On the U.S. West Coast, the Pacific Maritime Association paid registered dock workers $2.31 billion in total wages in 2022 alone. A full-time longshore worker averaged $197,514 that year before benefits, and benefits add roughly another $100,000 per worker. The current contract raises the top hourly rate to $60.85 by 2027. For a mid-sized terminal running multiple shifts, a realistic labor bill lands around $39 million a year. Next, the Port Authority. Your lease isn't free use of someone else's land. It comes with a minimum annual guarantee, plus a fee on every container that moves, whether that container makes you money or not. Call it $18 million a year. Equipment doesn't run itself. Cranes need scheduled maintenance, yard tractors need diesel, and reefer plugs draw power around the clock to keep refrigerated cargo cold. $9 million a year, conservatively. Insurance is its own category. Marine liability, cargo, property, and environmental coverage in case of a spill or fire. Call it $7 million a year. And remember that this line only moves in one direction, which we'll get to. Add $3 million a year in channel and berth maintenance assessments, Your contribution toward keeping the water in front of your own dock usable. $4 million in security compliance and terminal software. $5 million in administrative overhead. And $12 million in debt service on the equipment you just financed. Total before a single container generates revenue, $97 million a year. Here's how the money comes in. Terminals charge a handling fee for every container that crosses the dock. Real-world pricing data puts that fee anywhere from around $100 at the most efficient ports on Earth to $400 or $500 at a typical U.S. port, depending on the container and the service. After the Port Authority takes its cut, a realistic number an independent terminal actually keeps is around $200 per container. Now the volume. A genuinely mid-sized terminal, not the giants, a real independent operation, might move 500,000 containers a year. Multiply it out. 500,000 times $200 is $100 million in annual revenue. Subtract the $97 million in annual operating costs from Section 2. $3 million is what's left. On $100 million of revenue, sitting on top of a $150 million investment, that's a 3% margin, thinner than a grocery store's. And that's pre-tax, assuming the Port Authority's cut, the labor contract, and every lease term landed exactly as modeled. That 3% assumes a clean year. Full volume, no accidents, no lawsuits. It almost never stays that clean, and the thing most likely to break it first isn't inside your terminal at all. The variable that does the most damage sits entirely outside your control. The price shipping lines charge to move a container across the ocean, and by extension, how many ships they send your way. In 2019, the average cost to ship a standard 40-foot container, tracked by the Drewry World Container Index, was $1,420. In September 2021, during pandemic-driven demand, that same index hit $10,377, a spike of more than 600% in under 2 years. Every port and terminal in the world got busier, and it looked like the good times were permanent. They weren't. As shipping lines raced to order new vessels to cash in on those rates, that new capacity hit the water just as pandemic-era demand cooled. Rates collapsed roughly 79% from that September 2021 peak within about 2 years, and carriers responded the way they always do, canceling sailings, skipping smaller ports, consolidating calls onto fewer, bigger ships. Here's why that matters to you specifically. Your handling fee per container might barely move. What moves is the number of ships that show up at all. A terminal built and staffed for 500,000 containers a year can watch that volume swing by a third in either direction, based on a rate cycle set in boardrooms in Copenhagen and Geneva, for reasons that have nothing to do with how well you run your gate. And the cycle didn't stop there. Starting in late 2023, security threats in the Red Sea forced much of the Asia to Europe trade around the Cape of Good Hope, instead of through the Suez Canal, adding significant transit time and tightening capacity all over again, pushing that same index back above $4,000 by mid-2026. This isn't a shock you plan around once and move past. For this industry, it's the normal operating weather. Now picture a company built for exactly this kind of swing and surviving it for 4 decades, until it didn't. In 2016, Hanjin Shipping was South Korea's largest carrier and the 7th biggest container line on Earth. 98 ships, nearly 3% of global container capacity. A terminal in Long Beach that it partly owned. 6 months later, it was gone. At its peak, Hanjin ran 98 container ships crewed by roughly 2,500 sailors, carrying almost 8% of all trans-Pacific trade into the United States. This wasn't a scrappy startup. It was the flagship of a South Korean industrial conglomerate that also built Korean Air. The trigger was the one every shipping line was living through. Years of chronic overcapacity. Every major carrier had ordered bigger ships to chase lower costs per container. Capacity grew faster than global trade did, and freight rates stayed depressed for years. By mid-2016, Hanjin was carrying roughly $5.5 billion in debt, and its creditors decided they'd seen enough. On August 31, 2016, Hanjin filed for receivership in a Seoul court. The spiral was immediate. Ports around the world, the same ports that had welcomed Hanjin ships for decades, turned them away, afraid they wouldn't be paid for docking, fuel, or unloading. Within days, dozens of vessels were stranded at sea or under arrest in multiple countries. Roughly 540,000 containers, worth an estimated $14 billion, sat frozen on the water, while retailers waited on inventory and factories waited on parts. Freight rates on some China to US routes jumped 50% in a single day, purely from the shock. Here's the detail that belongs in this video specifically. Hanjin owned 54% of the company, running one of its own main terminals, at Pier T in Long Beach, a facility handling roughly a quarter of that port's volume. Owning the terminal didn't save it. That terminal's biggest customer was Hanjin itself, and when Hanjin couldn't pay, the terminal's volume fell by half, and it posted a $37 million loss for the year. A South Korean court declared Hanjin bankrupt in February 2017, ending a 40-year-old company. Its Long Beach stake was sold off for a combined value of roughly $133 million, a fraction of what it once represented. This wasn't bad management in the way that phrase usually gets used. Hanjin's own chairman later called it a game of brinkmanship, that every major carrier was playing at once. This was industry structure. An entire sector had spent a decade building more ships than the world needed, and the company with the least room to absorb the losses went first. Now, a cost that shows up on no projection anyone hands you before you sign the lease. Cranes fail. Not often, but when a ship-to-shore crane goes down mid-operation, a motor burns out, a boom sustains structural damage, a part has to ship from overseas, the terminal doesn't just lose the use of a $15 million machine. Using standard industry throughput assumptions, roughly $75 per container move, 30 moves an hour, around-the-clock operation, one idle crane costs a terminal about $35,000 a day in lost capacity. That's not repair cost. That's just the moves that don't happen. Walk through what that does to one real transaction. A single vessel call, say, a ship carrying 3,000 containers at your $200 handling rate, is worth $600,000 to you on paper. Most terminal service contracts include a productivity clause, a guaranteed number of container moves per hour, with financial penalties if you fall short and delay the ship's departure. Lose one of your 4 cranes for even 3 days mid-call, and between the lost throughput and the delay penalty, that $600,000 vessel call can turn into a loss before the ship clears the breakwater. On paper, cargo handling is one of the highest margin lines in this business. In practice, it's one bad bearing away from negative. There's a cost on this stack growing faster than every other line combined. And it isn't labor and it isn't fuel. It's insurance. Specifically, the part of your bill tied to the size of the ships calling on you, which you don't control and can't opt out of. Container ships have grown enormously over the past 2 decades, and insurers have been tracking what that growth does to claims. According to Allianz's annual shipping safety analysis, the frequency of container ship fires generating claims over $500,000 has more than doubled since 2017. Fires alone accounted for 18% of the total value of marine insurance claims in the period ending in 2021, up from 13% just a few years earlier. The scale of a single bad event has grown just as fast. Insurers now estimate that one serious incident on a large vessel, a fire, a grounding, can cost up to $1 billion once salvage and environmental cleanup are included. A collision between 2 of today's largest ships, in the wrong location, could run past $4 billion. You've already seen a small version of this. In 2021, a single ship blocking the Suez Canal for about a week triggered a compensation claim of roughly $600 million against its insurers. None of that liability sits neatly with the shipping line. Cargo fires, chemical spills, and salvage operations routinely happen at or near the terminal, and terminal operators carry their own layer of environmental and property liability for exactly that reason. Premiums for that coverage have been rising for years, tracking the claims. This is the one line on the entire cost stack that doesn't scale down in a bad year. It can erase every year of profit you've ever made in a single afternoon. Some of this gets easier with size. Spread $50 million of crane cost across more containers, and the cost per box drops. Bigger terminals get better financing rates, longer contracts with carriers, and enough leverage to negotiate real minimum volume guarantees instead of just hoping ships show up. But other things get strictly harder. Bigger terminals attract bigger ships, and bigger ships need deeper channels, which means your business now depends on federal dredging budgets and multi-decade infrastructure projects you have zero say over. Bigger terminals concentrate more value in fewer port calls, which means the billion-dollar casualty risk from the last section gets bigger too, not smaller. And bigger terminals need steadier, larger volume commitments to justify their size, which increasingly means becoming a captive terminal for one carrier or alliance, rather than an independent business serving many. That last point isn't theoretical. As of 2026, shipping alliances plus the single largest independent carrier control roughly 82% of global container shipping capacity between them, up sharply from a far more fragmented industry a generation ago. At a certain size, you stop running an independent terminal and start running an appendage of somebody else's shipping network. It's a completely different business, with somebody else making the decisions that matter. Two versions of the same year. Optimistic, full volume, 500,000 containers. Full rate, $200 retained per container, after the port authorities cut. No lawsuits, no major equipment failures. Every ship turned around on time. Revenue, $100 million. Costs, from Section 2, $97 million. Net profit, $3 million on a $150 million investment. That's the good case, and it's roughly a 2% return on capital. Realistic, one shipping line, responsible for a fifth of your volume, renegotiates and moves to a competitor's terminal after a contract dispute. That's 100,000 containers gone, $20 million in lost revenue, and your costs barely move because labor and lease commitments are mostly fixed. One cargo damage or workplace injury claim settles for $6 million, well within the range these claims actually run. One of your 4 cranes goes down for 3 months awaiting a part, costing roughly $4.5 million in lost throughput and penalty clauses. Recalculate. That $3 million profit is now a loss of roughly $27.5 million in a single year. None of this is a stretch. With global capacity this concentrated, keeping or losing any single carrier relationship can be the entire difference between the two scenarios above. The difference between those two scenarios is one lost contract, one lawsuit, and one broken crane. None of those are exotic disasters. All 3 happen to someone in this industry every week. So who's still standing? Increasingly, not many independent operators. The clearest evidence is consolidation. Shipping alliances and the largest carriers now control the large majority of global container capacity. And the terminal business has followed the same pattern, with major carriers buying up terminal stakes rather than leaving them independent. The primary cause of failure in this industry is almost never what the postmortems call bad management. It's structural. Too much fixed cost, too much debt, and too much revenue concentrated in too few customers. Exactly the trap that caught Hanjin's own terminal in Long Beach. That single pattern, one operator, one dominant customer, sits behind more terminal financial distress than any storm, strike, or recession. The operators who last tend to share 5 habits, and none of them are inspiring. First, no single carrier accounts for more than a small share of total volume, the direct lesson of watching a terminal get dragged down by its own majority owner. Second, debt-sized to survive a real volume swing, not the optimistic case, built to withstand the 20% contract loss from the realistic scenario, not just the good year. Third, equipment replacement reserves funded before any profit distribution, so a crane failure is a line item, not an emergency. Fourth, insurance sized for the billion-dollar tail event, not the average year, because the average year was never the actual risk. Fifth, cargo and trade lane diversification, so one collapsing freight rate cycle on one route doesn't sink the whole facility. None of these is a strategy for growth. All 5 are a strategy for still existing in 10 years, which, in this industry, is the harder achievement. So, buy a port. Collect money every time a ship touches your dock. That pitch is real, for about 3 cents of every dollar that crosses it, sitting on top of $150 million of risk you don't control. The port doesn't get paid when a ship arrives. It gets paid if it survives long enough for the next one to. If breakdowns like this are useful, subscribe.